Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. Today we are taking a little break from doing a Street Fighter character. Well, technically. Do a different fighting game character. We're doing Mai from the SNK game variety. Any of them, really, for the most part. But you know, we're gonna be. I suppose this is the reason why I say technically is because obviously she does appear in Street Fighter 6. And the design that I'm using here is closer to the Street Fighter 6 design, which is slightly different in certain little ways than a lot of her other designs. Certain things like the sort of thickness of certain lines, certain bits of color, certain things like that. Sort of, there's usually more white in certain designs, more black in others, more red in others, so on and so forth. But this one is, in terms of color and stuff like that, it's closer to the Street Fighter 6 design. That's what we're working off of here. And yeah, I'm also going to be talking about posing. That's the thing I'm talking about today. So yeah, I'll roll the intro and then I'll show you what I have. Alright, so this is what we've got. So, as I say, posing is what we're talking about today, and nothing else. So, yeah, well, I'll probably talk about other things, because I usually do. That was a joke, for those of you who don't know. But yeah, anyways, so let's take it from the top, and then work our way down. So, a few things which are worth noting. This pose is a sort of typical Mai pose. You see a few of these. There's sorts of ones of where she's sort of leaning forward. Sometimes she'll have the fan in her other hand here. Sometimes it'll be resting against her hip. What I've decided here is that she's holding it down. Sometimes she has that. Sometimes she has her hand resting on her leg, so on and so forth. Little things like that. Face is one which I think is worth noting, again, because posing isn't necessarily just what the body's doing. Sometimes the face is an interesting thing to pose as well. So I decided to give her a slightly different facial expression than what I've been normally doing for a lot of characters. I've done a wink before, I forget who I did it for, but I've decided to give her a wink because she's a very cheeky character, so that sort of fits. And a little bit of a smirk and stuff like that. So yeah. The hair, again, her hair is usually quite straight, so that's something I've tried to keep here. And sort of the way that her hair falls in front of her eyes a little bit is something from the older games, usually, from a lot of the older King of Fighters games that she appears in. It's in a lot of the sort of Shinkiro art. You see some of that, sometimes, depends. But that's obviously what they pulled from for Street Fighter 6. And so that's what I'm working off of here. Certain things like the robe being a little thicker in parts, that's an older design element as well, because as time went on it got thinner and thinner and thinner. But yeah, so here I've decided to use the thicker one, because that's closer. Yeah, I mean, I suppose in Street Fighter it's a little thinner than this anyways, but yeah, I've decided to go for a slightly thicker one just because I think it's a little bit more interesting. And yeah, a lot of these areas where there's black would ordinarily actually be white in some of the more recent designs. You know, even in some of the older designs, it's white as well. Just sort of depends. And then some of the designs have patterning on parts of the robe. I'm not going to be doing that. This one is just going to be the flat red. That's closer to the old designs. But the length of the front of the robe anyways varies a little bit. Sometimes it's a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. So here it's sort of medium length. And then whatever this is, I don't really know what this is, to be honest. This is closer to how it appears in Street Fighter 6. Yeah, I have no idea what that is, to be perfectly honest with you. And these little sort of bits on her ankles, sometimes a lot more decorated, sometimes not at all decorated, sometimes they're barely a thing. So yes, I also need to note that there is still sort of the skeleton of whenever I draw a foot, I usually sort of box it out, because it's easier to do that and then trim in. It's the same thing I do with the hands. You can sometimes see it, but the fingers usually go out of that box where toes would normally sit inside of it. So that's just a little note there for how I do that. That's why you've got these little weird sort of frames around the feet. But I need to remember that there is actually a weird little sock thing on her foot as well, which ends here. That's what that little extra line is there, and it goes down from there at the side of the foot as well. Because that is something which you can very easily forget. But yeah, so a little bit more for the pose. I suppose I should be talking more about that. But whenever you're drawing a character who's leaning forward, you have massive pain. I can attest to this because I drew this, obviously. So yeah, massive pain to draw a character who's leaning forward sometimes, because you have to remember proportions. Whenever a character is leaning forward slightly, their top should be a little bit bigger than than everything else. So for example, her head and her shoulders and her chest are a little bigger than her waist and her legs. Normally that would probably be the case anyways, but in this case it kind of has to be as well. Same way the fan is a little bigger than I would normally draw it, just because she's supposed to be leaning forward. So it has to convey that. And then things like the body length and things like this can start getting a little hard to keep track of. It's a very dynamic pose, it's very interesting looking when you do these sorts of things, but it can be very difficult to keep track of. And so yeah, like the sort of weird, it's a thing I've mentioned a couple times before. There's a sort of core line whenever you're drawing a body, or whenever you're doing a pose. Usually, it's best to try and keep that line smooth. So I'm going to literally draw it out so that you know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to put it into this. So I'm going to use the blue. So here, the line is like this. The line goes down like this and like that. That's a smooth line, more or less, from where the body moves. Then we get the other leg like this, still smooth. And then we sort of go out from that and then there. Still smooth. And then we go down like this. This one's a little bit straighter. But yeah, smoothish lines are sort of what I try to keep here because it looks a little better. But yeah, that is, and then even with the sort of this thing here, with the sort of ball on it, it's also a smooth curve. Depends on the character. Sometimes you want those lines to be sharp and jagged, because that can sort of give you different sort of shapes. Things like that can be interesting. But for the purposes of this, smooth. Whenever a character is supposed to look relaxed, like here, those lines should be rounder, softer, more relaxed looking. And yeah, she's supposed to look comfortable and relaxed. So it makes sense to have those lines be a little bit more rounded. Where if we're doing an action pose or something like this, sharpen your lines, point things more, have more perspective going on because it's more dynamic looking. But yeah, anyways, that's what this is like. I covered all the stuff I really wanted to. I mean, yeah, mostly for the, yeah, I suppose for the most part. The little things, I suppose, details like obviously there's a little bit of movement going on here because I suppose maybe the idea is that she's sort of leaning into this pose, so her hair's falling out a little bit that way. The robe is sort of fairly stagnant, but yeah, the sort of this thing is flopping out that way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a couple of little effects because this is technically a Street Fighter drawing. It fills that role for the purposes of this batch. So in that regard, we're going to be doing some of the effect stuff on the background. So I'm going to have sort of fire effects and stuff like that in the background. Probably maybe some like flower effects or something like that as well, because that maybe fits as well. But yeah, that's something along the lines of what I'll go for. Yeah, nothing too complicated for the most part that I can think of. Yeah, trying to think, is there anything else I really need to cover? I don't think so. I think so. I'm probably happy to start here. And then I suppose if there's anything I forgot, I can always just cover it whenever I come back. Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do these details. I'll be back to talk about the colors and maybe some detail stuff that I forgot if I do forget any of it. But yeah. So, it is now over, well, about a week later. This one took a while. Mostly because, to be honest with you, the first section of this didn't even take that long. It was just I didn't have as much time on the day as I thought I would. So I wound up having to take a whole bunch of breaks, and then you probably saw the last chunk was in the evening. It is now approaching the evening of this day. So it's, yeah, as I say, nearly been a full week since the last time I recorded this. So I'm really, this is, I think, maybe the longest one of these has taken in terms of time. Like actual real world time, I think, technically speaking. I'm not sure. Regardless, there's probably a bunch of things which I intended on saying after finishing the details section that I now no longer remember. I think I was talking about posing. I don't even remember anymore. We were supposed to be moving on to the colors section. I didn't go too crazy on some of these details. I sort of tried to keep things simple so that whenever I went back through, it wouldn't be too challenging. I changed the shape of this eye. I have not been terribly happy with it, I must say. And I think the I have the wrong brushes. I think that some of these things I'm a little off with. I think the shape of the mouth isn't quite right. That's the wrong layer. I think the shape of the mouth isn't quite right. I think it needs to get a little harder of an edge. That looks right. Sort of harder and a little rounder. That looks a little bit better to me. Then bring out the edge of that. Up a little bit there. There, that's a little bit better, I think. And then the shape of the eye is a little different. Not like hugely, to be honest. It's just a little different. The eyebrow is actually what's more different here, to be honest. The eyebrow is a shorter, earlier cutoff. It cuts off here. Opposed to where it cut off before. Which really that's not important at all. It doesn't change much. The eye is a little bit narrower. Yeah, the chin is a little thinner as well. Little things, I suppose, that have changed, but they're not actually that important. But yeah, as I say, I'm not sure what I was really intending on talking about. The sort of bit here at the front of the sort of the dress / robe here sort of falls in an interesting way, which I was quite happy with. The sort of it sort of bunches out in the front. It almost has this like it has a bit of a pit here, and then it falls down. So in a lot of fabrics, you'll see that, especially if they're a little looser, they'll sort of bunch up in particular ways. Your shirt will often bunch up in that particular way, of where if you sort of lean forward, maybe it forms a bit of a dip in the front, and then whenever you lean back, that will sort of smooth out. Here, because she's leaned forward, we've got a few more of these sort of dips here and things like that in the fabric. And I think it's still reasonably obvious that she's supposed to be leaning forward. I think so. I'm pretty sure it's not any real different than there. But yeah, I don't know. There was a few, I suppose, maybe design things which I sort of didn't touch on, such as this is obviously this is closer to her design in Street Fighter 6, but it'd also be taking a lot of cues from the sort of earlier Fatal Fury designs, which is, I mean, also where Street Fighter 6 pulls its design cues from. Where in more modern designs there's the sort of rope bits, things like that obviously isn't here. It's just the sort of rolled up sides of the sleeve, or just even the edges of the dress here, and then sort of things like these little trims here on the socks and the sort of black, the black here and stuff like that, and then the fact that this is mostly black. These sort of simple little things, and then even the sort of sash in the middle is also black. Where on other designs it sort of varies. I think there's maybe patterning on it in the Street Fighter 6 design, but I'm not sure if I'm going to use that because that's sort of a little cumbersome. I kind of just want to finish this one and not be too worried about it at this rate, because yeah, I feel like some of this stuff is not terribly important. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is it's fairly accurate. There's a few sort of patterns and things like that which I'm not going to use sort of the bottom down here that has a bit of patterning on it. I'm probably not going to use that because that's the Street Fighter design. I think the ball here has some patterning on it as well, which I'm also going to have to use. Mercifully, because the fan is closed, I don't have to worry about patterning on it. Yeah, that's about everything I really needed to talk about there. For the most part, I think that's kind of everything covered. For the most part, we're dealing with red and white as our colors. And that's gotta be the case anyways. But yeah. I'm trying to think, is there anything else I really needed to say? Color-wise, again, as I say, this is not terribly complicated. Background is going to be something which I also have to worry about. So I'll probably pull a little bit from what a lot of the Street Fighter 6 art has, which is it's usually a combination of a couple of things. It's usually it is the let me see. Yeah, it's usually sort of flames, sort of orangey, maybe reddish kind of flames, sort of pinky tones a lot of the time for the backgrounds. Petals, things like that. I'll probably use a combination of the flames and petals. That's probably what I'll do. And then maybe have, yeah, just sort of pinky tones. I think is probably what I'm going to use for the background. Because, I mean, that's the interstitial point between red and white. So that's probably what I'll be using. That makes sense to me. Right. Anyways, I will move on. I'll start doing these colors, and then I'll be back to talk about the shading in some variety. The painted shading, that is. Anyways. Right, well, that is our colours done. That took a little while. That's also mostly because I did the painted background stuff as well, and that took a while. So I decided to do kind of everything in the background. There might be too much going on, but we'll see. There's a lot of colours in the background, which is why our gradient map is going to be important. There's a lot of vivid ones as well. So I decided to go through and I did the sort of the general flames sort of thing, the way I normally would do it. Added in all these sort of little blotches and things like that, just because whenever I'm painting the fire and things like that, I feel like it doesn't necessarily come out very right. I usually, whenever I'm drawing fire, I'll do it with a hard edge, just so that it's clearly fire. Like I'd go through and I'd manually draw in the sort of little sort of hard edges around it and stuff like that. But whenever I'm painting it in, it's usually, again, it's more natural looking, but I find that it's harder to sort of convey that it's actually supposed to be fire outside of the colors. So I went through and added all these little sort of blotches of random little extra bits of color that sort of move through it and things like that. So whenever you're painting in these sorts of things, it's useful to do an underlying layer of white, and then layer up from that, and layer up from that, and then layer up from that. And this is all our fire stuff, and there we go, that's the full fire. Then I decided to add in the sort of petals in the back. You know what, I'm actually going to make them a lower opacity because I think they're a little much. I'm going to make them like a 30%. I think, yeah, that looks a little bit better because otherwise they're just a little too distracting, I think. But yeah, you just need to be able to see that they're sort of working through in the background. But yeah, I think having them at a lower opacity is a better idea. There's the sort of orange ones as well there, and those are a little harder to see. I just decided to put those ones in there just because that will work a little better with our color palette as we're going through, and chances are the gradient map that I'll use will probably wind up washing some of this stuff out a little bit. So to have the orange ones in there is probably a good idea because they'll still sort of be visible. But yeah, I also kind of wanted to have them blend a little bit into the fire in the background, and making orange ones would be the smarter way of doing that, at least to me. So yeah, let me have a think. Is there anything else I really need to go into? Not really. I'm going to be using sort of sunset-y tones for the shading, but I'm not necessarily going to use sunset tones for the actual gradient map. The gradient map itself will probably be a sort of a fairly red, a little bit of pink, a little bit of white as our, well, probably not going to use white. Probably use a pale pink as the lightest color, have a bit of orange, bit of, yeah, maybe it might wind up being something a little sunset-y, but not as sunset-y as our sort of tones here are. Anyways, I'll do this painted shading and then I'll be back to talk about the detailed shading and the last stuff like the gradient maps and all that stuff. Yeah. Alright, I took a big break. You'd think I would have learned my lesson from that after how long it took to get, you know, the last part of this done. But anyways, moving on. So, I've done all the painted shading and everything. I didn't do anything too crazy. I sort of fiddled with the opacity on it a few different times, and what I settled with was 50%. I initially started doing the painted shading over everything. What you see I have over here is I went through and I did it for each individual layer. That's normally what I do, but I was going to do it just as I would the detailed shading of where it's just one layer that's attached to the whole folder. But I just was not having it really, so I decided to do it individually as I normally would, just because it's easier to organize, and so it's easier to just sort of make sure that everything's interacting correctly whenever it's sort of layered out like that. But yeah, so for the detailed shading, it's the same thing, using the same colors, the sort of the almost sort of maroon kind of, I don't know, kind of red, and then the sort of light orange. I don't think there's anything really else too unusual there to worry about. I think I'm just going to do a normal white light line, and the other stuff is, yeah, going to be mostly just as normal. There's nothing else really unusual I think I'm going to be doing here. Gradient map, I'm going to be, as I've already mentioned this, I'll be sort of working up the sort of reds and pinks and maybe a little bit of orange in there, but not too much. Yeah. Anyways, I will do this detailed shading and the light line and all that stuff, and then I'll be back to do the last few gradient maps and then wrap up. Yeah. Okay, so that is our detailed shading, light line, and our first gradient map done. So as you can see, this is a weird gradient map. So let me get into this. So I put in a lot more tones than I normally would all of these are sort of various reds. So we've got a darker red, sort of more maroon as I've been using in some of these other shading areas, sort of fairly flat plain red, an orangey color, yellow, and then pink. And I brought the pink back a little bit so that it occupies more space up here, so more of our highlights and lights are pink, so that this area here isn't squashed, isn't sort of like crunched down into some other color that I don't want it to be. And a lot of our whites are sort of pink toned, as you can see, and a lot of them have a bit of a yellow hue as well. So that means that all the sort of shading around here is nice and yellow, as it should be. So all the sort of lighting on her looks like it's being affected by the fire, but the background still sort of maintains its normal colors. This area over here gets a little orange, pretty orange and red, but that's fine. That's not too worrisome. But yeah, all our sort of petals and stuff like that are all still very visible, so that's good. So that's on 60% now, so that's a little lower than I might normally have it. But yeah, we're going to see what our other gradient maps look like. That's very vivid. It crushes down our red here as well, so I'm going to put that at 15%. I'm very curious to see what the color burn looks like, because that is very intense normally. So I might even want to consider putting a lightened layer on this as well. Have a look. Let me see how I feel about that. Lighten in there and bring it up. The lighten actually only affects her, which is interesting. Just sort of washes things out, which I don't really want. Multiply. No, that's gonna be too dark. Hue. Oh, hue's nice. I might actually keep hue on. Saturation definitely not. Color definitely not. Luminosity is what we've already got on. Hue I might use. I might even use it at 100%. Yeah. What's weird is that the area down here becomes more pink and the area up there becomes more orange. That's a sort of a weird flip. So maybe I'll turn that down to like 60%, 65 perhaps. A little more subtle, but it still sort of works for what we want. And what about saturation? Saturation, yeah, no, we definitely don't really want that. That's a hue. Hue actually works quite nicely for what we have here. Yeah, hue at 65%. It's just a sort of a nice little sort of lightening of certain things. It keeps things very much within what I want them, but it doesn't start to look too blown out in certain areas. I wouldn't normally go up to 4 gradient maps, because 4 gradient maps things can start getting a bit blown out. Yeah, I think the color burn actually does make things it makes them a little deeper. The soft light is that one. And luminosity just sort of makes things a bit darker, which is fine. I think all these gradient maps are actually fine. I would maybe even consider getting rid of one of them, because 4 is a lot, but I think 4 here works surprisingly. Again, as I say, I wouldn't normally go up to that number. 3 is normally even a lot, I feel like, anyways. But 3 is what I use these days. I used to only use 1. Only use 1, and then sometimes I'd use 2, and now it's 4. I mean, on some, this I'm just putting in the texture now. Texture that goes over everything. So put that in overlay. Set that down to 15%. We don't want this to start looking too crunchy. So let me see. And the details in the background. Maybe even make it a little lower. And I think is good. Mostly going to be visible around these areas where it sort of gets a little lighter and things like that. Yeah, even sort of with the gradient maps, I tend to sort of vary. I would usually use more on sort of bigger pieces, but for the purposes of the art show, that's normally simpler stuff, so I wouldn't normally do that many gradient maps. I mean, if I was like painting something or something like that, I might use like 4, sometimes 5 grade 8 maps. Depends on what on how the paints are sort of coming out. But that's all. I mean, obviously, still digital painting. So that sort of, yeah, it just sort of varies a bit in terms of how that winds up coming out. But here, I'm actually happy with the 4. The 4 works pretty well. Yeah, yeah, I'm happy with that. Yeah, I think I talked about everything I wanted to. I think I talked about all the posing stuff at the start. I'm hoping I did. I'm hoping I did because I don't remember. It's been nearly a week, so I have no recollection as to whether or not I did that correctly or not. I'm just gonna pray and hope I did. I suppose I'll find out in the edit. But yeah. Otherwise, I think I sort of, yeah, I've covered everything I wanted to say about the sort of the colors and things like that. And sort of all the paints and different sort of effect stuff that was mostly for the background. But yeah, yeah, I'm happy with that. I'd say I don't think there's anything else I really need to cover. Sort of came out how I wanted it to. We're as I say, we're getting close to the end now, so a lot of the topics have been very truly covered. I feel like, anyways. I mean, as I say, we've done nearly 200 of these episodes, so yeah, and 200 is where we're ending, so we're nearly there. Anyways, I think I'll yeah, to start doing the outro, and then that'll be that. So if you like the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking or not. I would of course prefer if you did like it, but you know, I can't make you, so do as you would. The same deal if you want to subscribe, go for it. I would much prefer if you did that than anything else, but you know, you don't have to. The thing you can do. I'm just reminding you. And yeah, if you have a suggestion for something you'd like to see me draw in the future, there isn't much of a future left, and yeah, I'd get on it if I were you. If you have a suggestion, you can leave it. I might not get to it. Once the art show is over, so to speak, I might still come back for an episode here or there if there's a suggestion or something that people really want. But you know, if there is a suggestion that I see that might be interesting, I might still do some of those. But otherwise, we'll see. It remains to be seen. But yeah, with all that said, I think that's us. So I will say goodbye and I will leave you. I will see you in the next one and all that stuff. So yeah, yeah. If you choose to watch the next one, that is. Anyways, leave mine. I'll leave you. So.